So the thing that we're going to spend time on today is basically looking at, now that you've thought through this sort of map of the whole experience, how do you pick particular learning activities or blended learning activities that support the particular learning objective? And so today we're going to focus on that, identifying blended learning project learning activities, or and maybe looking at some of the micromodule formats that we've been putting together. I want to just do a quick highlights version of what we're really thinking about when we're thinking about learning activities and overall strategies for things. So I'll go through each of the gap areas. So starting with knowledge, who's driven a car in the last day or two? If you have, just you can just put Y in the yes in the chat, or raise your hand if you've driven in the last day or two. Okay, bunch of people. All right. So when you're driving somewhere, you might see hundreds of cars, right? If you're, especially if you live in a crowded city or something like that, you might see hundreds of cars, and these cars are all coming into your sensory memory, which is your kind of the memory, the very short memory that you use to just scan the environment. But which cars were you likely paying attention to while you were driving? Of the hundreds of cars that you saw, which ones were you actually like focusing on or paying attention to typically? Which cars did you care about while you were driving?
The ones I'm facing.
The ones right around you, right in front of you, in lanes adjacent that are right around you. Okay. But when those cars move on, so if the light changes and those cars move and other cars come in, how likely is it that you're going to remember the cars that were around you? Do you typically remember them, or do you forget them and let them go? Yeah, most of those cars you'd forget. And so the way that this works is you have this image of cars coming into your sensory memory, and then you focus on certain cars. But once those cars have moved on and they're not around you anymore, you probably forget them in about, sensory memory lasts a few seconds, potentially up to a few seconds. Working memory is a little bit more like 30 seconds. Once a car's moved on, you're probably not going to think about it anymore. However, anybody remember a car that they've seen in the last few days? Does anybody remember any cars that they've seen in the last few days? Any of them? Anything jumping out? Nobody, none, zero. All right, let me think about that. Okay, Meg, what car do you remember?
I was walking our dog yesterday. My husband pointed out, I think, an electric Porsche. I don't
Oh,
know.
wow.
Yeah, which was parked on the street, which is also ridiculous. So
An electric Porsche. I did not know that they were making electric, but
may have not been a Porsche, but it was like a very fancy.
Yeah. Yep. I still notice Teslas when I see them. Whenever I see a Tesla, I'm always like, ooh, Tesla. A beautiful white BMW convertible is one of those. Okay. So typically the cars that you might remember a day or two later, which are things that have made the jump from your working memory. And we throw things away all the time. Like it's part of our job for our memory to forget stuff, because you don't want to remember every car you've ever seen. That would be too much. But the ones that stick tend to have a few characteristics. They tend to be unusual or surprising. So a really beautiful electric car, or a really lovely BMW convertible, or something that stands out because it's unusual or surprising. Emotional reaction, a car you were mad at while you were driving, something where there is maybe an accident is going to provoke an emotional reaction, some car that's meaningful or relevant. Has anybody done the thing where you decide you're going to buy a particular type of car, like you're going to buy a Honda Accord, and then what happens when you're driving around? You make the decision, I'm going to buy a Honda Accord, and then what changes about the world around you when you're out driving? Yeah, you see them everywhere, right? And so you have this focus that changes when you decide that I'm going to buy a Honda Accord. I suddenly see them everywhere because it's meaningful or relevant to you. Anybody ever have that kind of sentimental thing when you see a car that's the kind of car that you like, was like the first car you ever had, or the first car you drove, or the car that your friend in high school had or something? You know what I'm talking about? Where it's, oh, that one. So previous experience with something might cause you to remember stuff. If you interact with it, if you drive, or if you're constantly stopping and going because this car in front of you is driving too slow and they keep hitting their brakes and things like that. And then just pure repetition. Does anybody know what kind of car their neighbor drives? Could anybody say, yeah, I can picture my neighbor's car? Yes, Elaine is, yes, I can totally picture my neighbor's car. And you don't ever make an effort to realize what car your neighbor drives, but you just see it often enough that it becomes something that sticks. So these are usually the kinds of characteristics that cause people to remember information later. It's unusual or surprising. It's emotional reaction. It's meaningful or relevant to me. I can do something with it. It's an association with something that I have previous experience with. I interact with it, or I work with it, or I do something. So you are more likely to remember the categories on the table that we were just looking at, because now we've repeated it. You worked on it last week, and then we came back to it this week. You interacted with it because you filled it out. You used one of your own problems to answer it, so that makes it more meaningful or relevant. And then we had the repetition piece of seeing it more than once. And so we were using probably three of these strategies to help make that one a little bit stickier. And so these are things that we want to look at when we're creating, when we have knowledge-based objectives. Is the question that we always want to ask is, what's going to cause somebody, if this is something they need to remember, if this is something they need to carry around in their head, which of these strategies are we going to use to help them remember it, to help them keep it in mind? And refreshing comes into repetition and previous experience and some of those kinds of things to help accelerate. Because one of the things I mentioned, that this is some of the best research principles in educational psychology, which is spacing effect, or distributed learning, which is we forget things. So if I teach you something new today, if I teach you how to say please and thank you in Lithuanian, I've got a little language app where I'm learning Lithuanian. So if I teach you those words today, you will forget them pretty quickly, probably, because my guess is most of you, maybe some of you, but most of you probably aren't using a lot of Lithuanian as a language in your day-to-day usage. And so your forgetting curve is going to be like that red line, where you could learn it, but then you'd start to forget it pretty quickly. But if I come back and I remind you tomorrow, and then the next day and the next day, every additional touch point, and there seems to be some value to sleeping on things. So doing a touch point that comes at least a day after is usually useful, makes it a little bit less likely that you're going to forget it as quickly, until it starts to become something that's pretty durable and that you're going to remember permanently. So those are two of the big strategies we use for knowledge-based material.